I say hijacker, and you think destruction, death, terror. But before the events of 9/11, before the new normal, there was just normal. December 26th, 1971, the day after Christmas. Air Canada Flight 932 from Thunder Bay to Toronto. It was the end of a long day for the flight attendants when a passenger walked into the galley with a note.
We're taking over the plane. We're going to Cuba.
A note, a gun, a coded message to the tower. So begins the first hijacking in Canadian airspace. A case left for dead until coincidence links it to the infamous tragedy of September 11, 2001. In true crime, investigation and conviction may take years. But every detective knows that the crucial clue is always there, somewhere in the first 72 hours. In Toronto, a hijacked plane is stranded on the tarmac. Its passengers disembark, oblivious to the danger. But the crew is trapped on board. Below the plane, police attempt to defuse the situation. Barry King and his partner Dan Banting were two rookie cops back then. King remembers that night.
One of the officials there from Transport Canada gave me a microphone and a set of earplugs, and he said, "Here, you can communicate with the pilot." Underneath the aircraft, looking up, and the pilot's got a small window that he's right beside, and I tell him not to worry. We've got some people right here, right around us. And then he said, "I think I should tell you that he's listening to this right now."
Like other cops, neither have had any specific hijack training. Except, don't let the plane leave the ground.
Tell them to refuel the plane. He wants to go to Cuba.
And the next thing I see is this man lean up over the first officer, and I see the gun in his hand.
What to do? The crew is up there in the cockpit. He has a gun. He wants to go to Cuba. The plane needs fuel to get there. The two young cops make the decision to let the plane refuel and leave for Cuba. Dan Banting recalls.
A 28-year-old constable and a 24-year-old constable made these decisions. There was just no input from anyone. We were two men adrift on a tarmac. Today, in this day and age, it would be almost ministerial.
Yeah.
How these decisions would be arrived at. Back then, it was shoe leather and being a cop. You just made your decisions and you had to live with them. Seeing that jet disappear off in the distance, and you just kept your fingers crossed. Went back to the station, made coffee, drank coffee, went home, turned on TV. Back then, TV only went till about 2 o'clock in the morning. Sat on my front veranda, went back down to work the next day, had never slept, and waited.
5:30 a.m. Flight 932 returns to Toronto.
The crew appeared tired when they came back, but the captain, I think, felt satisfied that the right choice was made.
Had something gone wrong, you and I wouldn't be sitting here now chatting, that's for sure.
You wouldn't want to talk to us either, probably.
No, you probably wouldn't want to talk to us.
A stewardess says she served the hijacker a soft drink, then set it aside for fingerprints.
She was great. I don't remember her name now, but I certainly remember how we all felt. You know, you want to give her a big hug and say, "Geez, that was terrific."
The stewardess gives the officers one other key piece of information, the hijacker's name, Patrick Critton. Within the first 72 hours, Banting and King have two valuable clues. It would have been a good start for most crimes. But when a warrant for his arrest goes out, Patrick Critton had effectively disappeared into the sugarcane fields of Cuba. There, the Americans couldn't touch him, and the Canadians couldn't find him. Cuba's way of dealing with some hijackers was forced labor in the hot sun. While Critton sweated in the cane fields, the case went cold. For 30 years, the file sat with other unsolved cases in this innocuous police building. The unsolved hijacking is chosen by a detective to test his unbeaten record. Detective Don Jorgensen had solved every cold case he'd ever taken on.
As a challenge, I found the oldest outstanding warrant and decided to see if I could locate the accused. All we had was very much tombstone information, you know, date of birth, name, and a brief description. I went through the normal police procedures originally and came up empty. There was no record of Mr. Critton at all, whether it be current or historical. But usually when you enter something into Google or any search engine, you get usually an overwhelming number of returns. So when I entered Patrick Critton's in, I was expecting to get any number of returns, but I actually only got one.
In this case, one hit was gold, an article from a suburban New York online newspaper. It's about mentors for African-American youth, and one of the mentors is Patrick Critton. He's a director of a community school and a teacher for residents of a youth shelter. This Patrick Critton is in Mount Vernon, New York.
My first step in trying to firm up the identification, I contacted a friend of mine who's a detective with the New York City Police Department and had him take a cursory look at the Mr. Critton from Westchester County.
This Patrick Critton fits the description of the hijacker as he might be today. Mid-50s, 5'4", and black. Discreet questions are asked of friends and colleagues, like fellow teacher Odine Mangum.
I think all of Patrick's students loved him. He was a tough taskmaster, and which I thought was unusual looking at Patrick's size. Physically, he's a small man, but he commanded a lot of respect. I think of Patrick as a very passionate man.
A man with a passion to serve his community. Could this really be the same man? The man who hijacked Air Canada Flight 932 to Cuba at gunpoint? On a street in Mount Vernon, New York, a police officer shows passers-by the picture of a missing girl. It seems innocent enough, but in fact, one passerby may be the 1971 hijacker, Patrick Critton.
We didn't want to jump the gun. We certainly didn't want to tarnish a man's reputation if it turned out that we had been mistaken. I made contact with my counterpart in New York City. He and I came up with a plan in which he would obtain fingerprints from Patrick Critton.
Critton had given his fingerprints to the school board when he became a teacher. Now, police need a fingerprint to absolutely confirm his identity and tie him to the hijacking. Jorgensen gives the laminate to fingerprint expert Gordon Bell.
The fingerprints that we had on file from 1994 when he filled out the application to be a teacher recorded all 10 fingerprints, so we had the left and the right thumb on the same card.
The left thumbprint just obtained matches the print on Patrick Critton's teacher identification card. The right thumbprint taken in 1971 from the can of pop also matches.
Fingerprint definitively identified him as being the person that was on that aircraft.
The teacher, the friendly neighborhood tutor, is also a fugitive.
I think Mr. Critton was probably looking over his shoulder every day of his life. But I'm sure in the back of his mind, he knew that things that he had done some 30 years ago were still on record somewhere. And he may eventually have to pay the price for them.
What took you so long?
Patrick Critton's first words are, "What took you so long?" He may not be surprised when he is arrested, but everyone else is. Especially his friend and supervisor, Odine Mangum.
My reaction to his arrest was disbelief. I couldn't believe it. Although Patrick is a strong person, a strong personality, I couldn't believe that he was violent in any way. Everything that he did with a zest, a zeal. Violence never entered into anything that he did in the 6 years he was with this agency.
For Patrick Critton, arrest also means release. The secrets of his extraordinary life spill out to Detective Jorgensen, non-stop for 7 hours.
I was nearly spellbound. Mr. Critton is a history teacher by trade, and he lived through very tumultuous times in modern history.
Critton left his childhood of poverty in Harlem to be one of the first black university students in New York City.
Mr. Critton described his evolution from a student activist, being involved in the student government of Hunter College in New York City.
In Harlem, new voices of black liberation, like Malcolm X, are aimed at young men like Critton.
Eventually, as he became more politicized, as he put it, he became involved in the Black Panther Party in the United States, which was certainly an above-ground, upfront organization.
But Martin Luther King's assassination changes everything. How can working within the system make sense when that system targets men of peace?
And eventually, he became involved in the Black Liberation Army, which would have been an underground organization that was involved in what were described as terrorist acts, from bank robberies to bombings in the late 60s and early 70s.
A group called the Republic of New Africa had a goal. It wanted a separate black country within the borders of the United States, a goal to be reached by any means necessary. And Patrick Critton was ready to help secure the funds. July 1971. Critton put his life as a married man with a child and his career as a teacher on the line.
He and 4 other people decided to rob a bank in New York City. He was lookouted on the sidewalk out front of the bank and fled the scene before police arrived. He would have been tipped off by the sirens. The bank robbery was unsuccessful. 1 person was killed, 1 was wounded, and the others were captured.
Now Critton was in deeper than he ever anticipated. He was on the run. Jorgensen has tracked down more than a hijacker. He's captured a fugitive from an armed robbery. His comrades arrested, 1 shot dead. Critton feared his own capture was next. He told his wife she should forget him, start a new life. He's going underground. A desperate Patrick Critton fled the U.S., convinced he's the hunted fugitive of an armed robbery. Christmas 1971. From one mess to another. Patrick Critton flees to Canada, but a snowstorm traps him in a Thunder Bay motel room. He works out another escape route. This is 1971. There are no metal detectors for flights within Canada. The next day, he leaves Thunder Bay on a plane headed to Toronto. 15 minutes before landing, Patrick acts on his plan. Think. We have fragmentation grenades and a .38 caliber revolver. take me to the captain in the cockpit. We are going to Havana, Cuba. This is no joke.
Once Mr. Critton walked off the plane on Boxing Day, we had never heard from him. There was no information as to where he went.
30 years later, Critton is arrested and makes the front page of the New York papers. But he's only in the very early morning editions. It's September 11th, 2001. Another hijacking becomes front page news in New York and around the world.
It was both bizarre and pretty eerie that here I was down in New York City and having just been involved in the arrest of a hijacker. It was very ironic.
As the detective escorts his prisoner back to Toronto for trial, both men wonder how the events of 9/11 will impact the course of justice. In Toronto, Patrick Critton engages a lawyer well known in the black community, Irving Andre.
I was very concerned about Patrick getting a fair trial, while it was in the very aftermath of September the 11th.
At trial, the prosecution asks for a heavy sentence, citing both the violent nature of the hijacking and Critton's criminal behavior as a bank robber.
We had to confront that in some fashion, the Crown would seek to advise the judge that Patrick Critton had been involved in those acts. Robbery, in which there were casualties. There was no way we could have avoided that. What we did, however, is that we suggested to the judge that you cannot give an accused person a heavier sentence for acts for which he was never charged, for acts for which he was never found guilty.
Critton thought he had been charged for the 1971 robbery. He never knew he got away scot-free. That's why he hijacked the plane in the first place, to flee to Cuba to escape U.S. justice.
Here was certainly not a person who fit the mold of the terrorist. He'd become a responsible citizen. He'd assisted underprivileged persons. He came back to the United States under his own name. He continued that work. It was almost as an extension of the type of social commitment which he manifested way back in the 60s.
You know, in Mr. Critton's time in the 60s and 70s, hijacking an airplane was a tool to either get a political point across or to make good your escape. Whereas as of September 11th, hijacking an airplane becomes a weapon.
And to that extent, September the 11th was helpful to us, because that act in September of 2001 gave us a clear picture of the monstrosity of true terrorism.
And he said to the stewardess, "Would you take this paper to the captain?"
Defense counsel Irving Andre takes the court back to the night of the hijacking.
When you had a couple stewardesses saying that he never threatened us. He tried to make us feel comfortable.
Even the pilot thought Critton wasn't a threat, as long as they were going to Cuba. In closing, Irving Andre returns to Christmas night, 1971.
If one has to speculate as to what was going on in his mind at that time, it was one perhaps of total abjection, depression, and the realization that he had to do something to get himself out of that predicament. One of the interesting ironies of this case was that Patrick Critton, ironically, upon his arrival in Canada in December of 1971 in Thunder Bay, could have purchased a ticket to Havana, Cuba, without the necessity of having to hijack any airline.
But Patrick Critton had hijacked that plane. Since this was Canada's first hijacking, and the criminal code had no provision for the offense, Critton was actually on trial for kidnapping the plane's crew, armed robbery, using the gun to steal the plane, and extortion, threats to engineer his escape to Cuba. Today, We call that hijacking.
I believe that when the sentence was handed down, Justice Casey had put a lot of thought into the sentencing.
It was beyond our expectations. When he went back to the institution, Maplehurst Detention Center, he was greeted with wild cheers. People were clapping him on the back, and it was almost as if he'd won the lottery.
In fact, the judge gave Patrick Critton only 3 years and a recommendation for early parole.
As a police officer, I'm proud of what I did. It sent a message that if you are a victim of crime, despite the fact that 30 years may pass, we will continue to pursue the case. And the officers who were the initial investigators of this hijacking 30 years ago gathered as much evidence and information as they could in the first, say, 72 hours. It was the information gathered then that eventually allowed me to capture Patrick Critton 30 years later.
Patrick Critton spent a total of 1 year and 10 months in jail in Canada. He was released in June 2003.
I think that Patrick was, he was ready for the system. He was ready to be judged. He was ready to pay the price. If he walked through this door, unfortunately, I could not hire him, not in the same capacity, because in the school system you cannot have anyone with a felony conviction working with children.
Patrick Critton is out of jail, but for a man whose passion is teaching, his sentence may never be over. The stories on 72 Hours are true. The detectives and forensic scientists are the ones who actually worked on the case. The names of the victims are fictitious. The names of the convicted are real.